I'm going to talk about podcasting today. And in particular, we're going to listen to some clips of the documentary that that she mentioned that was released about maybe almost 2 months ago now. Teddy Goes to the USSR. And we'll listen to like 4 clips. And with each clip, I'm going to explain some of the mechanics, the reasons why I did certain things, and how they fit into the whole promise, I think, of audio in learning. Just to give it a sense of how many of you listen to podcasts? 1, 2. Okay, you can turn on. I'm curious, like what kind of podcasts? Tell us, like, what's your favorite? What do you listen to a lot, etc.
Conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theories. Okay. What is it? Is that what it's called?
No, it's part of, Dax Shepard does one called like Armchair Expert, and then he has a whole bunch of branches. He has one that's called Armchaired and Dangerous, done with David Farrier. Okay. And they study a bunch of conspiracy theories.
Cool. And you, Renee, I think you raised your hand.
I didn't know you were going to ask a follow-up. I'm super guilty. I listen to a lot of like the rewatches with the cast members of certain shows. Like I was watching the Scrubs one, or listening to the Scrubs one, and now the Boy Meets World one from my childhood. And my wife has gotten me into My Favorite Murder, which the true crime is. True crime
is very popular. Yes.
Guilty, but yes.
Anyone else?
Mine isn't as fun. Since I'm planning to open a charter school, I've been listening to everything about superintendents.
Okay.
In schools and that sort of thing across the country.
Yeah, this is one of the things about podcasts is that they're very niche, I should say. And it seems to be there are podcasts, and granted, with the 2 million out there, there seems to be a podcast about everything for everyone. I do a podcast, which I'll talk about in a bit, about Russia, and that's a very niche. I don't expect to become a gazillionaire, nor do I ever expect audience to be like, millions of people or even hundreds of thousands of people. Though, as Zita said, my podcast, which started in 2015, has been downloaded. Actually, it's not 1.3, but actually 1.5 million times. So, it's in the genre that I work in, and the audience that it appeals to, I think what I've done is incredibly successful. If you consider the fact that out of the 2 million, only 1% of podcasts, this is really amazing, only 1% of podcasts get more than 1,000 downloads a week. 1% of that 2 million. And I'm proud to say that I'm in that 1%, probably the only 1% of anything I'll ever be in. So anyways, onward. So yes, as I said, I actually have one ongoing podcast, which is the SRB podcast. This is a weekly show that deals with Russian or more Eurasian politics, history, and culture. It's an interview show. It comes out once a week. I interview scholars, journalists, and others who are, have some knowledge about the region, about various topics and things they're working on. And then the most recent one was a 6-part documentary, my first foray into audio narrative, and I'll talk a bit about that in a few minutes, called Teddy Goes to USSR. And this is what we'll be listening to some clips to, and I'll talk more about that as we move on. But I just wanted to present those in case you're interested to listen to my podcast or use it in your classes, which is something I will talk about towards the end after we listen to some clips. So these are the 2 podcasts I'm involved with. And as Zita said, I am working on a new documentary series. Actually, I'm working on 2. One is a small one, which might be 2 or 3 episodes, which is about Stalin, somebody mailing Stalin a piece of feces in 1935. And the report, they were generated reports analyzing the substance to figure out what it was. So I have a whole thing on that. And the second one, which is really the thing I've been working on for very long, I've been researching for over 2 years now, is a story of Black Americans, communism, and the Soviet Union in 1920s and 30s. Told through the story of the life of Levitt Fort Whiteman, who, as Zita said, is the only Black American we know of who was a victim of Stalin's terror. So it's a story about how did this guy from Dallas, Texas, end up dying in Siberia in 1939, and the international communist movement and race and African Americans. So it's a big thing. And the research for that has been in 3 countries: Kazakhstan, Russia, and the United States. So please feel free to break in and ask any questions. I should have stated that at the beginning. I'm free to address whatever concerns you have specifically. It's not important for me to get through whatever I have to say. So as those of you who aren't too familiar with podcasting, I've become a big booster of them in the last couple of years. But essentially what a podcast is an audio file sent through a feed, which is called RSS, that you can get with one of these devices, usually a phone or a computer or something. Most people, I think, listen to podcasts on their phone. I know I do. And what I find as a preview of like what the value of them is one of the things I like audio versus say video is audio is mobile, in the sense of video, you have to stick with the screen. You're tied to a screen. Audio allows you to do other things, walk the dog, do the dishes. Most people who listen to podcasts listen to them doing other things: in the shower, driving a car, on the bus, walking, dishes, cleaning, walking the dog. I listen to podcasts this way. My partner listens to podcasts this way. This is what's really great. It frees you up. I really like that aspect, particularly in terms of the potentials it has for education. It removes people from the screen. You're not tied down. Now, there are many different audio formats that have developed. The more and more as audio becomes something more people are getting into, experimenting with. In many ways, my involvement in doing audio work reminds me of my early young adult days in punk rock, where it's a lot of is do it yourself. You can do podcasting with very little money nowadays. The technology is there. I tell students, for example, if you don't have good microphones, which can be expensive, and other equipment, this thing, your phone. Phones have great microphones today, and you can record pretty decent stuff using your phone. So you don't need a fancy mic that I have and other equipment. Granted, having those things is wonderful, but for students, people who don't have access to resources, you can do a lot of great things with a phone. In fact, I just heard the other day that Steven Spielberg shot a music video using a phone. So, if he could do it, who can't? Podcasts come in a variety of different forms. It's an ongoing show like the one I do, the SRB podcast, or it could be a series like Teddy Goes to USSR, something that's self-contained. It can be seasonal. Seasonal is actually the form of podcasting is more and more popular. Here, it's similar to like television shows where a season will have X amount of episodes, and they usually are strung together around a common theme. So if you listen to one of the more popular podcasts out there, Malcolm Gladwell's Revisionist History, it has seasons and it does different topics or different themes in every season. Or some people just do one-off episodes just to make some art. And I think that one of the things that I really like about it is the artistic qualities of podcasting. The types of formats are many as well. The common ones are an interview show, which is what I do every week, right? I have somebody and I ask them questions and they give me answers. One of the most well-known radio shows, Fresh Air on NPR, is that kind of format. Another one is a monologue, where you just have one voice, a person telling you a story or, a personal diary, these types of things. Panel discussions, which are very popular and I have to say very easy to do in the podcasting world. You get a couple of mics and people to sit around and chat. This is actually my least favorite type of podcast. I tend not to find them that interesting. And there's nonfiction or fiction narrative audio, which I think is my favorite. This is what Teddy Goes to the USSR is. It's a kind of, it could be documentary format, journalistic format, essentially basically writing a story through audio. This is the most common, I think. And then there you can have narration or non-narration, and I could talk about the differences between those two. And the last one, which is making a big comeback since early days of radio, were radio drama, right? Before television, you'd have whole dramas enacted on radio. This is making an interesting comeback. It's nice to see people doing dramatizations. There's a really great one called 1865, which is about the assassination of Lincoln, that's dramatized, that I highly recommend. So the point being is that as podcast if you're a podcast listener, you would know this. They're coming in all variety of forms. The only thing I will say about podcasting today is it is experiencing what I call corporate capture, in the sense that more and more podcasts are being taken over, or media companies are getting involved in producing podcasts. So for example, a friend of mine who does audio work, she said that when you get a contract with, I don't know, one of these podcasting companies like Wondery, what they're interested in is not necessarily the audio. They want to know if they can roll it into a book, into a television show, into a movie. This whole panoply of media is now, podcasting is becoming a harvest for new types of media production. And some podcasts have actually gotten television shows as a result. So, I think one of the drawbacks to this corporate capture is that eventually what happens is it squeezes out people like me, people who aren't interested in becoming a millionaire, people who are interested in the genre and like to tell stories. It's getting harder and harder to get an audience because you just don't have the resources to promote yourself. So this is I can talk more about the state of podcasting, but this is it. Now, does anybody have any questions? No? All right, well, let's listen to some clips from Teddy Goes to USSR. The first clip I'm going to play is from the first episode, which deals with introducing Teddy and his trip, who he is as a person, and some of his general impressions and first impressions he had when he landed in the Soviet Union. I'm going to play the clip, and then I'll talk about the context behind it and give a bit of the origin story of the podcast, how I decided to do this thing. I'm going to play this, and if you don't hear anything, please let me know. Oh, I don't hear anything. Oh. No. Hi, folks. Give me a second.
It was working.
Yeah, I could hear
but
something.
It was coming through my speakers and going through my microphone.
Oh, gotcha.
So that's not good. Here, I'm gonna play it again. Let's see. Here are the results. Yes. Over the next 6 episodes, you'll hear how Americans and Soviets made sense of it. Okay, I'm going to start it over. All right. Oops. Technical fail. There we go. Here are the results. Over the next 6 episodes, you'll hear how Americans and Soviets made sense of each other, and through that, themselves. Sorry. Oh. Last time. Here are the results. Over the next 6 episodes, you'll hear how Americans and Soviets made sense of each other, and through that, themselves during the Cold War, that global struggle between the United States and the USSR from 1945 to 1991. Now, I grew up in the 1980s, when Cold War tensions flared, and I remember how the Soviet Union and its people were portrayed as dangerous, suspicious, and scary. Nuclear Armageddon could happen at any moment, because the Soviets hated our way of life. They were, as Ronald Reagan put it,
let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual...
I don't know what's going on here. There you go.
Domination of all peoples on the earth. They are the focus of evil in the modern world.
So the Soviets were scary, evil, and that makes Teddy's trip there so fascinating and predictable. Fascinating because he went there as a tourist to see the evil empire. Predictable because Teddy's assumptions, suspicions, and expectations were common American views of the ultimate enemy. This first episode introduces Teddy and looks at his experience as an American tourist. Mass tourism to the Soviet Union began as a trickle in the late 1950s and peaked in the 1970s. Americans were some of the largest groups of foreign travelers to the USSR. What did tourists like Teddy encounter behind the Iron Curtain? Later episodes will examine the KGB efforts to monitor tourists, delve into Soviet consumer culture, uncover the Soviet obsession with American racism, and present a snapshot of the daily lives of Soviet people. Teddy's travels, observations, encounters, and recollections will serve as a window. But ultimately, this series is about assumptions. The assumptions that seep into our mind about foreign places, how we imagine them and their people, and how we anticipate their look and feel. This was especially the case with the Soviet Union. It's been 30 years since the USSR faded from existence, yet it still weighs on us, still haunts our present, and shapes how we imagine the future. Okay, so maybe am I having some problem here with Zoom? Whatever. Are you sure with advanced sharing option sharing Oh, yes. I had a bit of a, everybody heard the, oh, here's my presentation. Thank you. I just got confused. So this, the reason why I did this documentary was I got an email from a Ukrainian journalist in late 2019 who had been going through the secret police archives because in Ukraine, why is it paused? Oh, because in Ukraine, they opened up the secret police archives after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he found this KGB report about this American tourist named Teddy Rowe. And Edward, the journalist, proposed maybe we could work together and do something with it if we can find him. And I did a bunch of searches and I found that Teddy is alive. He's in his 80s. He lives in Billings, Montana. And I went and flew to Billings and interviewed him for over a weekend about his trip to the Soviet Union. Teddy went to the Soviet Union in 1968. And what's extraordinary about his trip is that it was 3 months and he went to every single Soviet republic. Most Americans who went to the Soviet Union as tourists in that period went, you know, like you would go tourism anywhere, like for a week, 10 days, you tended to go to Moscow and Leningrad. But Teddy had this amazing experience of 3 months in the Soviet Union. He took over 200 photographs and wrote a 400-page diary of his travels. So after I met him and awkwardly emailed him and said, hey, are you Teddy Rowe who went to the Soviet Union? Because we have a KGB report about you, which must have been really creepy. They were, following him around and surveillancing him. But this clip, the reason why I play it, and this goes, I think, into the more pedagogical aspects of podcasting is, if you want to have students do podcasting, is individuals are nice. Talking to Teddy, listening to his stories are great, but individuals don't make great stories, in my opinion. So one of the challenges I had was taking an individual like Teddy and his story and saying, how can I put him into context? What can people who might listen to this learn about Americans going to the Soviet Union, tourism in the Soviet Union, what life was like in the Soviet Union? How did Americans understand what life was like in the Soviet Union? And you'll see this you'll hear this in some of the other clips. So that was one of the things I love about this type of podcasting is you can take an individual's story, whether they're alive or dead, and you can do it and put it in a larger context of his time, in this case of Teddy Rowe's time, late 60s Cold War, 1968, that pivotal year. Here is another clip. Here it's also from episode 1. Here we have Teddy towards the end of his trip. He's on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and he runs into, to put it lightly, various roadblocks presented by Soviet bureaucracy, and this is what happens as a result.
Sean, I don't believe we're hearing anything.
Okay. I'm having major failing here. Hold on one second. Okay. Did you hear the clip that I was playing? Anyone? No?
No.
I hate technology. All right, let me try this again.
I know you said that it was paused before, so I think if it's paused, it won't come through with the sound if you're sharing sound.
Yeah, I think I did something wrong. Yes. Okay. Share sound. Sorry about this. Let's see if we can play this again. Can you hear this?
Despite the US and the Soviet Union locked in a global rivalry, Teddy found Soviet people were quite friendly, at times helpful, and even looked out for him. Like Don Raleigh, Teddy met the devil, and he wasn't so bad after all. In late June, Teddy found himself on the Trans-Siberian Railway. It was a bumpy ride in his sleeper car, the fourth of more than a dozen cream-colored and maroon cabins, pulled by a bright green diesel engine. The train departed Irkutsk, bound for the Pacific port city of Nakhodka, the final leg of Teddy's trip. Now, if you remember, InTourist provided almost everything a tourist would need, and one of those things were special coupons Teddy could use during his travels. Think of them like those old American Express traveler's checks.
They gave me a good bunch of those in Moscow. I got more of them when I was in Yalta, and more still when I went to Siberia.
Teddy was supposed to use these coupons in InTourist hotels, restaurants, and train dining cars and the like. At least in theory, as they found out on the train to the Far East. When he had his guide ask the dining car manager if the coupons were valid,
it turned out that he had never seen them, didn't know what they were, and said, "It's beyond my power to do anything."
Annoyed, Teddy decided to boycott the dining car and get by on the snacks he could buy with rubles.
And the word started getting around among the passengers, including my bunkmates, that they were starving the American in the car. I was the only American on the whole train for the entire time. And I'd have people on my bunk and sitting around and chatting until wee hours of the morning.
That's when one of his bunkmates, Pavel, stepped in.
Probably thought I was broke, and he told other people. And when he got off, the new guy came on, and he had just come from his parents' private plot of vegetables, etc. And he knew about me before he got to my seat, and he dumped on me a bag of goodies, 18 hard-boiled eggs, bunch of cucumbers, this, that, and the other thing. Nobody was going to starve on his watch.
And the new guy and a few others then marshaled to the dining car manager.
And he rallied the troops. He got a woman and another guy, and they went down and talked to the person in the dining car. They did the bargaining for me. And the guy said, "Oh, excuse me, can I show you the menu?" Because I said, "You want to starve me? You did it."
The incident, no matter how annoying, left Teddy with a good memory and a positive impression of Soviet people.
Those that I met on the Trans-Siberian were a real bonus, and the people themselves were absolutely delightful for the most part.
So I like this clip for a couple of reasons. First off is that hearing Teddy tell his story brings it alive, right? Here is his own personal experience, these various clips of his impressions. But more so, I thought this scene really showed some of the real kind of daily aspects of the Soviet Union that I think people who want to learn about, say, Soviet history or life in the Soviet Union can really learn a lot from. And that is, here's Teddy running into Soviet bureaucracy, right, with these coupons. Nobody knows who they are, what they're for. And in a lot of aspects of Soviet life is people getting around that bureaucracy and the rumor mill of gossip that goes through the train. Here's this American. And a lot of it is because of foreigners. There's a lot of performance, which is another interesting aspect of Soviet life, of people coming to the Soviet Union. And in many respects, that's not different than other places around the world. But really confronting this bureaucracy, finding a way around it, and then, of course, challenging it too, like marshaling these people to go to the dining hall manager and say, hey, what are you doing here? We have this American, they don't want people to leave with a bad impression of Soviet life. So I felt that this clip, in my efforts to try to capture the complexity of daily living in a place in 1968, this is one of the ways I did it, was through some of these anecdotes that Teddy had in his travels. The other thing too, in terms of the larger issue, say the Cold War, right? We tend to think of, the Cold War in these larger diplomatic, high politics, geopolitical things. And one of the things that this story about Teddy's visit to the Soviet Union gave me, and I think it gives listeners, is these human interactions, what they called in the Cold War people-to-people relations, where, if you have regular Americans meeting regular Russian or Soviet people, they kind of find out that life is not that different. Their concerns are not that different. Part of the documentary in episode 3 and also in episode 5 deal with this aspect of, well, what was the Soviet dream and how did it differ than the American dream? And surprisingly, despite different contexts, a lot of the aspirations were similar. And I think that was it's really important to show, to, de-exoticize Soviet life. And this, one of the purposes of this documentary series is to do that. Let's listen to another clip. Any questions before I play? No? Yeah. Okay. Now, this next clip is taken from episode 4. The episode is called Teddy Talks About Race. And the context for that episode is Teddy is asked repeatedly, what's with you Americans and race? Why are you still lynching Black people? He's asked like 5 or 6 times, and he gets visibly frustrated. But this inspired me to do an episode about, well, what was this all about? Like, how did Soviet people, why were they asking this question? What did they know about, say, Black life in America? What did they know about the civil rights movement? So this 4th episode deals with that. It deals with how the Soviet Union journalists reported on and understood race in America and understood the civil rights movement. And also a bit about Vietnam, which this clip plays to. And the purpose of this episode was to look at some of these issues and get around the idea that it's just all propaganda. It was propaganda, but there was more to it as well. And that points to a sense, part of being a Soviet person was to be in solidarity with people of color around the world. So that this episode explores that. Let me play this clip.
So it's not surprising that along with civil rights, the U.S. war in Vietnam was also a point of focus and sarcasm.
They're fascinated by the Vietnam War, and they write a lot about the Vietnam War. So much so that American officials get really worried. Like, the only part of Soviet reporting from the United States that Americans are really worried about is Vietnam.
Vietnam and American racism were stories that told themselves. Soviet reporters had to do little to cast a pall on America's global image. And American officials knew this. And sometimes, Dina says, U.S. officials privately admitted Soviet propaganda wasn't always wrong. Take, for example, the reaction to Boris Strelnikov's short article, Arsonists. Strelnikov opened with telling his Soviet readers about Smokey, a bear cub that was rescued from a New Mexico fire, and all the cute American kids who visited Smokey. Strelnikov also noted that the U.S. military tasked the same fighter fighters who rescued Smokey to start forest fires in Vietnam.
And so he ends this piece with comparing the American kids who go and see Smokey the bear cub in the zoo and Vietnamese kids who are being smoked out of their house and forests by the same people who saved Smokey the bear.
The article circulates around the Soviet desk in the U.S. State Department, and people start commenting on it.
So the first comment says something like, hardly innocuous example of recent Soviet propaganda. And then somebody else says, sadly though, not unjustified.
Smokey the bear, he can find the fire before it starts to flame. That's why they call him Smokey, that was how he got his name.
So this clip was, the purpose of it was to show this strange tension, because so much of the Cold War was about propaganda. But I also wanted to show how, there was a consciousness that this was a lot was propaganda, right? The United States and the Soviet Union were in this struggle over whose system was better. But at the same time, we can't ignore the fact that some of the propaganda from both sides, right? The US propaganda against the Soviet Union and Soviet propaganda against the United States, a lot of it had kernels of truth and how that was negotiated. And this is really the heart of this episode about race. I also like this clip because I couldn't help when I was putting it together of including that Smokey the Bear song at the end to give a little bit of irony, a little bit of humor, because I remember Smokey the Bear as a kid too. And when I was interviewing Dina Feinberg, the woman you heard in the clip, I was totally taken with this story that she had of finding this article in the U.S. State Department by this Soviet reporter and officials commenting on it. So I thought putting that children's, and this is one of the great things about audio, you can insert other sound to create context, to create an emotional feeling that I think goes beyond texts. And this goes to the final clip I want to play. As a historian and other people who are trained in history, audio is a very 20th century type of technology. We don't have recordings of people in the past. Most of what we have are texts. So how do we render texts in audio? And I think there's a lot of advantages that audio has. One is, well, let me play the clip and I'll talk about why I like this use of audio in turning texts into audio. This clip is again from episode 4 on the race. And one of the things I wanted to give to listeners was, well, what did Soviet journalists say about the civil rights movement? How did they report on it? And when I started reading some of these articles, I was actually surprised, because I was expecting the Soviet reporting to be, just propaganda, just like empty, complete rhetoric of just useless. And what really surprised me is actually there's some decent reporting in the Soviet press on the American civil rights movement. And this clip is just one, and I wanted to show, get listeners to know this. So I had to figure out a way. So how do you do this in audio? And this is what I came up with.
Reading over Soviet press coverage of the civil rights movement offered other surprises. The reporting was more detailed than I assumed. Soviet journalists covered the protests and boycotts to desegregate schools and universities, transportation, restaurants, and other businesses in cities and towns throughout the South. All the high notes were given playing time. Authoring Lucy and the desegregation of the University of Alabama in 1956, the Freedom Rides in 1961, the church bombing that killed 4 black girls, resulting in demonstrations and police violent reprisals in Birmingham in 1963, and the March on Washington, to name a few. Reports on violence dominated, including the beatings of freedom riders William Barbie and Jim Zweig, the murders of Emmett Till, Medgar Evers, John Robinson. But violence is newsworthy. At rare moments, Soviet correspondents focused on the movement's methods and culture.
Огонек, number 21, May 1963. Dr. King's Christian organization led the demonstration in Birmingham, but the Student Coordinating Committee participated in this battle. It left its mark on events. Demonstrators, as always, gathered in the Negro church. The church is the safest, and in the South, the only place where Negroes can gather. But they didn't sing prayers, but songs of freedom composed by students jailed in March. And even when the old prayers of the Negro spirituals echoed, the words were new. Our enemy's segregation, just like a pail of garbage in the alley. And before I'll be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave.
Segregation is our enemy, it must be removed, just like a trail of garbage in the alley. Oh, it must be removed. Oh, we shall know.
So I was really surprised because that they had an article on SNCC. I thought that the Soviet reporting would stay, and I was actually surprised by their treatment of Martin Luther King, which was far more sympathetic than I assumed it would be, because of his Christian, him being a pastor, Christian faith, Soviets being anti-religion. I thought they'd have a lot of skepticism, but the reporting of Martin Luther King was surprisingly very sympathetic and fair. And from some Soviet memoirs of Soviet journalists, he was also greatly admired what he was doing, even amongst KGB officials who engaged in various kind of dark activities to discredit King as part of the larger Cold War. They personally say in their own memoirs and statements that they actually personally admired him, which is gives another complexity. But the point of this clip, though, was how to render a historical document. Here I had somebody do a voiceover to read the document, and then the fact that the passage that was read ended with this quotes from this very famous song from the Civil Rights Movement. I was surprised by the attention that the Soviet journalists gave to that, but it allowed me to combine those lyrics that she's reading with audio from the sound from the song as well, to blend those together. Again, one of the things with audio and here with music elicits emotion. And you run music under audio, say, to make it faster so it doesn't sound like it drags, to give the illusion to the listener that things are moving, but more so to match music, and this can be quite difficult, with a particular emotional response that you want the listener to have. One guy named Rob Rosenthal, who's been teaching audio narrative for 2 decades now, says quite provocatively that music in audio is emotional fascism. It's there to elicit, to force an emotion. And that's, I think, the other thing that I really love about the medium is that you can do things through sound that tries to bring this history to life, that tries to elicit a response. And as educators, one of the challenges we have is, well, how do you get students interested in historical materials? And one of the things that audio and podcasting allows, in my opinion, is a way to make these things more accessible. And that's what I want to talk about to end with, because the question is, okay, that's nice, Sean. You just gave us an advertisement for your audio work, but why should we care? Well, I think for a couple of reasons. And here, to sum it up, is this translation, and it really is a translation of text to audio. How do you render things that we normally interact with words into sound? And why do that? Well, first is, and this is from my experience of doing this, academic-ish podcast every week, where I talk to a lot of academics who write, very detailed and sometimes impenetrable books about very esoteric subjects. I found that audio can translate that work into something that's more accessible. Just to give an example, I'll hear an interview. I won't read a book on, let's say, some whatever topic, Russian ballerinas, let's say. I'm not interested in ballerinas or ballet, but I might listen to a 45-minute interview about it. Why not? And I think one of the things that audio and podcasting provides, because it's such an inexpensive medium, and for the most part, podcasts are free to access, is, not everybody has or wants access to these often very dense and very expensive works of scholarship. And one of the things people like I do is try to make that more consumable through a conversation. Also, audio, as I said a few moments ago, it really can complement and add depth to texts, right? If you have a letter, let's say from a worker or a peasant from the 19th century, when you read it, you don't really get that much emotion from it. It remains surface. But I think if you take that text and have it read and maybe put some sound under it, you can enhance it and make it more to communicate, more effective to, say, someone who's consuming it. I also have become a big advocate of podcasts as an intellectual expression. It's not necessarily, when I say about making things more accessible, I'm not saying to make it less complicated or easy or dumbed down. I really think that audio, in taking it in its creative side, can provide people who produce intellectual expression, students, scholars, etc., a different type of engagement intellectually, right? How do you present these very complicated ideas in a different medium? I mean, you can ask the same question for film, right? How do you render, say, something as complicated like race relations in America or race relations globally in an audio form, right? Without dumbing down this very important material. So I think audio allows for a different type of engagement, and particularly it allows for multiple voices. In this documentary of mine, you can hear Teddy's voice. You can hear the voices of other scholars who are historians of the Soviet Union. You can hear the voices of Martin Luther King, Ronald Reagan, other audio clips, Richard Nixon, clips from the infamous kitchen debate between Khrushchev and Nixon in 1959. These things, like film, provide a better context, multiple voices. Students or people listening to this material can hear those voices, or those texts can be rendered with voices in an emotional way or in an acted way. Two, I also find that audio allows for those who create it, like myself, to bring scholarship to have more present day relevance. One of my favorite podcasts is a podcast called Throughline on NPR. And it's a history focused podcast. But one of the things that they do really effectively is they take stories of the past and show us how they still reverberate today, how they're still relevant for us today. And that's not always easily done in a consumable way in texts. I think audio does do that very well. And lastly, what audio does that texts don't do well is provide that sensory experience. Podcasts at their best form are supposed to create an environment. You're supposed to paint pictures. As again, to quote Rob Rosenthal, the guy who's been teaching audio forever, it's about don't tell, show. And that way, with sound, you can try to, as best you can, create an immersive experience for the listener as they go through this material. Now, what about the classroom? How can we use them? I actually teach podcasting to students. I had an idea, instead of having them write papers, I have them create podcasts. And it did a few things that were really great, wonderful. First is that it gave students other skills: how to interview, how to record, how to use editing software, how to think about presentation, music, narration. These are how to speak into a microphone, which takes, believe me, a lot of practice. If you've done it before, it gave them and writing. You have to write a script. My scripts for the Teddy documentary are 20, 30 pages an episode. So here it allows for students to create in a different way and learn a bunch of different skills that they maybe can use elsewhere. But like I said in the very beginning, one of the things I really love about audio is its mobility. You can present educational content through a mobile device, freeing both educator and learner from the constraints of the classroom, the constraints of a computer screen, and allows you to, so for example, when I teach a history class, I'm not going to assign a book for students to read, but I might assign an interview with the person who wrote the book that goes through its ideas in a more consumable way. Again, like I said before, I think audio allows for multiple voices. You can, as group, I have my students work in groups. So 2 people, 3 people, you can hear different voices in their audio pieces that are really wonderful. I've already spoken about some of these things about sensory experience and relevance. I think in the classroom, it does that too. And the intellectual expression, but really, I think it gets us as students and educators, get you to think about things that are really needed as you move through one's educational career in life. That are issues about presentation. How do you take an idea, render it in audio, and present it in an effective way? It gets you to think about narrative and storytelling. What's a good way of telling a story? How do you draw people in? How do you get the audience invested? It also gets us, as I think, to think about audience, of how we communicate to an audience. Because, coming from my background, which is mostly academia, academics by and large don't really worry about audience. They don't think about, who is going to read their book. Audio forces you to do that. You have to consider the listener. And lastly, what do podcasts teach us is about teaching. And this is one of the things as an educator myself in the classroom, I really took. First off, again, is storytelling. How do you tell a story? How do you develop a character or characters? How do you hook people in? The first couple of minutes of a podcast are the most important. People say you have about 2 minutes to hook a listener in, to keep them listening, to tell them why they should be listening. Also, and I've seen this in some podcasts that I listen to, the issues of authenticity and vulnerability. Hearing someone's voice, someone tell their own story, gives a level of authenticity that you don't necessarily get from a text. You get it a little bit with a text, but you get even more of it when you can hear someone's voice or a text being rendered in voice. But vulnerability is something that I find really fascinating. When you interview somebody for these projects, there are a lot of ethical concerns. And unfortunately, in audio, tears are currency. People's traumas can be currency. This is from an audio creator side, this can be gold. But at the same time, you're dealing with real people. And you have to be sensitive and understanding of those traumas, of those vulnerabilities. How do you deal with if you're interviewing somebody and they tell a really emotional story from their past? That makes you uncomfortable because you're in a position of exploitation. I'm exploiting this person's trauma for my art, essentially. So it brings up all of these questions of ethics and how do you deal with sensitive subjects? How do you render them, particularly as they're being expressed from somebody who've lived through them? And so I think it opens up this whole conversation of, ideas and people's experience and traumas. Audio allows for also experimentation. There's a whole genre of audio that's just kind of more artistic soundscapes. There's lots of audio that's a mix of poetry and interviews. And I think it allows for us to think about how we can use different mediums in our highly technological times: audio, video, web content, digitized, whatever and old school text. How do we use these various forms of media, put them together, and deploy them in a way that can be experimental creatively? I would love for students, teaching podcasting to really, I try to encourage them to think about, like, how do you use sound in an experiment? How do you change up the narrative? How do you do narrative differently with sound? Because narrative on audio is a very linear process. A book, you can go back, right, and say, oh, I didn't understand what I read. Let me go read it again. But audio, it doesn't really work that well. So given all these things of storytelling, vulnerability, ethics, experimentation, you also come back to the problem of simplicity. How do you present a story in this very linear medium that is consumable, where people don't get confused? And therefore, this requires a lot of repetition, a lot of signposting, things to think about. Again, going back to this question of audience, as educators, it makes us, at least speaking from my personal experience, doing podcasting has made me think of my students more and how they're receiving and taking information than before. It really made me have a consciousness of this. And lastly, again, the importance of relevance. Why should we care? And I think audio is one of those amongst many mediums where you can do that. So, well, that's all I have today. I want to encourage all of you, if you are interested in podcasting, if you're interested in thinking about ways to introduce it in the classroom, both from the consumer but also the creative side, I invite you, and I'm very serious about this because I've done it for many people already. I invite you to contact me. My email is here on this slide, guillory@pitt.edu, and I'd be more than happy to help you out, provide some ideas, come talk to your students, whatever, on podcasting. I've become a major promoter of this. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.